because this was originally seen off of Florida. And so we, at the time were in Florida, we had to drive our truck and our boat 3 hours north, I think it took to get us to get up here. And then it was 50 miles offshore still. So we had to get all the way out there. And thanks to this telemetry buoy, we knew where the whale was. And there was a plane up there as well. So it took all day, but they actually managed to mostly disentangle that whale, which was very exciting. We kind of took it as a success. Unfortunately, they left a little bit of line in the whale's mouth because it went through the baleen plates and it was very hard to get out. And so they can't just go in and open the whale's mouth and pull the rope out. And so they cut off as much as they possibly could and decided, okay, this is as much we can do, but we think this whale could be okay. We think that it can survive and maybe even get rid of that rope on its own. And so the whale continued to swim north. We never saw it again that season, but I think it was within the year in the feeding grounds we had heard that it was seen, so we knew it was still alive. Then the next sighting of it, no one saw it back here anymore. So that was a success story. But whenever you see these whales wrapped up in gear, it's not always that lucky. And not to mention that you can get all the gear off, but they could already be so sick and weak that they can't survive. And not only was this whale already kind of sick, but it was in an area there was no food. Of course, food makes you stronger. So this whale had to make it all the way back up to the feeding grounds, over 1,000 miles away, before it could really start to heal. But as far as we know, that whale is still alive. And the other interesting thing, sorry.
No, I just was you never mentioned the whale's name.
Oh, so that whale unfortunately doesn't even have a name. It was a 5-year-old at the time, a 4-year-old at the time. Its number was 4057, so all these whales have ID numbers. Some of them have names. Unfortunately, this one did not. Don't think it has a name at this point. But yeah, its number was 4057. The really interesting thing I realized about this is that its mom was down in the calving grounds that year as well. So these whales leave their moms after 8 months, and as far as we know, they don't interact ever again. But the interesting thing was that whale's mom was down there with a new calf that year. And I had actually seen that mom, and she's actually one of my favorite whales. Her name is, or she doesn't have a name also, but her number is 3157. And I saw that whale just days before it gave birth. And right whales giving birth is not something that's been documented very much. I think maybe once or twice down here ever. It's very, very hard to catch. You never know when it's going to happen. But there was one time where I was flying and we came across 3157 and she was by herself and we knew she was a female. She was looking kind of large. You can't really tell if they're pregnant, but you can make speculations if they look really fat. Fat is good for whales. So I remember we were watching her doing some really interesting moves. Just wiggling in ways you don't even normally see whales wiggling. And so me and the other observers with me, they were like, is she pregnant? Is she giving birth right now? And we were like, we didn't know. We hung out with her for a little bit, but then nothing happened. And so we were like, okay, let's just continue on with our survey. We ended up coming back to her later that day to check again. Still by herself, but we were all very I don't know. Something was weird about that. She's doing moving in ways that they're not supposed to move in. Her body parts were in different ways. Her tail was up in the wrong direction. We gave her the nickname Yogi because it kind of looked like she was doing yoga. But then a week later, she had a calf with her. So we obviously don't know when that happened. There was a week gap in seeing her. We saw her a week later, so it could have happened later that day. It could have happened 3 days later. But from then on, that kind of just made me like that whale for whatever reason. I had a connection with it, And so this was after the fact, 4057, her 4-year-old calf, got entangled down there. I was like, does she know that her 4-year-old is in trouble right now? They never were seen together at all, but it just really makes you wonder, do they know? Did she know her calf was in trouble? We'll never know, but it was just another interesting aspect to add to that whole situation. Okay, so there was a day that we had been flying all day. We had actually already had 5 sightings that day, so it was already a busy day. But we got word from another aerial survey team that had seen a whale that they thought was in trouble. They saw gear on it, so they called the nearest plane, which happened to be us. And we immediately stopped what we were doing, our surveys, and we headed out to where this whale was. And it was pretty far offshore, and the farther offshore you get, the clearer the water gets here. So it's this very clear, beautiful blue water. And so right off the bat, it was very easy to see the fishing gear, the rope that was around this whale and trailing behind it. And right off the bat, we could see that there was hundreds of feet of rope trailing behind this whale, and then it sunk down further. So we had no idea what was at the end of that rope. If it was just a ball of rope, if it was a trap. So once we got there, we immediately took lots of photos, data. We tried to see exactly what parts of the whale's body were entangled in the gear. Was it one flipper, both flippers? Was it in their mouth? Was it around their head? Was it around their tail? All these things are very crucial elements for the disentanglement team to know, because they need to know what areas to focus on. And I didn't say this before, but we actually found out later that at the end of that 400 feet of line, there was actually a crab trap at the end. And these traps are huge. They're probably about 6 feet in diameter and weigh hundreds of pounds. And there was so much line there that we actually believe that whale was dragging the crab trap across the ocean floor. And the crab trap was bent in certain areas, so we think at times it got caught on a rock and the whale had to use all of its might to pull and dislodge it to keep swimming. And so there was a lot of stress to this whale. And no one's positive, but there's a thought that that trap actually came from Canada. So this whale traveled from Canada down to Florida carrying, I don't know if they might know how much all the stuff weighed, but just the drag of it alone and the stress on the whale. And this whale was only 4 or 5 years old. But since then, that whale has actually gotten a name. 4057's name is now FDR, named after the president, because the president also liked to spend time between Canada and Florida. So that's how that whale got its name. In the disentanglement attempt for 4057, now named FDR, the disentanglement team was able to get most of the rope off of the whale. There was one little piece that was still going through its mouth that was lodged into the baleen, so as much as they pulled and pulled and pulled, they couldn't get that rope out. So they decided that the best course of action for the whale, and obviously the safety of the disentanglement team, was just to cut the rope as short as possible. So essentially it just had this piece of rope going through its mouth, but it wasn't long enough to get caught in the flippers or the tail or anything. So then the whale continued on, and we kind of just had hope that this whale would shed that gear on its own, but we thought, regardless, we still think even if it kept that gear in its mouth forever, we think it could still survive, continue eating, and be okay. So these whales that, even if they do get disentangled, they go on a list, like a kind of a high alert list, that if anyone ever sees these whales, you take extra photos, you take extra notes, and you send that to people immediately so that we can kind of monitor the situation and see if they are getting better. In that situation, we didn't think there was anything else we could do anyway, but it was just, everyone just had a lot of hope. We put a lot of effort and time into trying to save this whale, but at some point they have to save themselves. And so later that year, so this all happened, I believe, in February. Later that year, up in the feeding grounds, up in Cape Cod Bay, that whale was seen without any gear on it. And so in the end, that whale did get rid of its gear and hopefully is still surviving and thriving now. And so that was a very, very good ending to the story. But it did take us months to actually hear that info because the whale traveled all the way up north. And as we know, a lot of things can happen to them just in that journey. So for it to go up and find the food, somehow get rid of the gear on its own, was a very happy ending to the story, which we don't always get. So Boomerang is a whale that has a interesting story that she's famous for, but not really the story that we're always hopeful for. Boomerang had a calf. This was many, many years ago. And normally these mom calf pairs stay off the coast of Florida and Georgia during the calving season, but for no reason she decided to continue heading south, where she went all the way south and rounded Florida and made her way into the Gulf of Mexico. And not just a little bit into the Gulf of Mexico, she continued as far as Galveston, Texas, before she finally kind of realized that she wasn't where she was supposed to be and turned herself around and made her way back to the Atlantic, to the East Coast. And, since had found her way north again and done the migration probably many times since then. But it was a little worrisome for the researchers at the time because moms are trying to teach these calves as much as possible. The calves are only with mom for less than a year, so they have to learn as much as possible. And part of that learning is, if the calf happens to be a female, that this is where you're supposed to come to give birth. And the mom's supposed to teach them that. And we don't want this calf to think that it's supposed to go to the Gulf of Mexico every time. Because it might not be safe for it for various number of reasons, and the Gulf of Mexico can often get much warmer than the Atlantic Ocean, and these whales that have very thick blubber layers have the potential of overheating if they're in areas that are too warm. and just the shape of the Gulf of Mexico would probably be very confusing if they're like, oh, I should keep going north, right? And then they just hit land. So the Gulf of Mexico isn't really somewhere where we think they should be hanging out. So for Boomerang to take this very, very young calf over there was a little worrisome, but she brought him back. And I don't know how that calf is at the moment, but Boomerang has since gone on to have multiple calves since then. So she seems to still be healthy. We just hope she doesn't go back there again.